Hello, fourth grade, and welcome to Unit 3, Week 1. You guys have just started our third unit, so as soon as we're done with this, we'll be halfway through language arts for the year. We're going to get started with our vocabulary words, and your first word this week is the word scrounging. Now, scrounging is when you're collecting things with difficulty. So you're digging around for things. You're not easily just picking them up. You're having a hard time doing it. So the first example sentence says, the birds were scrounging for food in the snow. So anytime you have like a small animal or something who's digging around for food in the ground, or it's buried in something, or under bushes or things like that, they're scrounging. They're having a difficult time collecting those things. Your next word is the word jumble. A jumble is like a messy group of things. So you can say there was a jumble of papers on the desk, right? So they're not stacked nicely and neatly, and they're not organized, or grouped by whatever they're for. They're kind of just scattered and in a big messy pile. You can have like a jumble of toys, or a jumble of anything, just a big collection, a big messy group of things is a jumble. Your next word is the word logical. So when something is logical, it makes sense. It's reasonable. So leaving early for a new place in case you get lost is a logical idea, right? So you're thinking about it, you're thinking, what is a good decision to make? Something that has logic or is reasonable is logical. If something is done cautiously, it's done carefully. So when you are being cautious, cautious is a synonym for the word careful. So cautiously is a synonym for carefully. That means you're doing something with a lot of care, and you're being very aware of the way that you're doing it to make sure you do it the right way. Number 5 is the word acquaintance. An acquaintance is someone you just met. So an acquaintance is not really a friend. You're not close to them, but there is someone you've met once, maybe twice. They're not someone you spend time with. So maybe your new neighbor is still an acquaintance because you haven't gotten to know them very well. Or maybe some of the new students in class are still acquaintances because you haven't become friends with them yet. Your next word is the word scornfully. So if you act scornfully, you're showing dislike or disapproval. So scorn is something that's negative. So when you're acting scornfully, you're acting in a way that's very negative. You're not being nice towards that thing. You're not being polite towards that thing. You're showing that you dislike it or you hate it. So their example sentence says, an older boy scornfully told us to play in the other field, right? So something in a very mean, disapproving way. Number 7 is complementary. Now, something that is complementary makes something whole or complete. So the hats were complementary to their outfits. Now, compliment, there's 2 versions of the word compliment, and they're spelled differently. When you give someone a compliment, that one has an I in it. You're saying something nice to them, right? You're saying if you tell someone they look very beautiful or very handsome, that's a compliment with an I. When you have complementary or compliment with just the E's in it and there's no I, we're talking about something that completes something else. So you can say that the colors in the artist's painting were complementary to the scene that he painted, right? They made them complete. They put it all together. And your last word is the word trustworthy. So someone who is trustworthy is someone that can be trusted or relied upon, right? Trustworthy comes from the base word trust. And the worthy means they're worthy or they're worth that trust. So there's someone who has earned that trust. So I know my trustworthy friend will help me. That's your example sentence there. Let's take a look at our spelling words for this week. Now this week we're working on R-controlled vowels with ER, IR, and UR. Now, we've talked about R-controlled words before. Remember, an R-controlled word or an R-controlled vowel is when you have a vowel that's immediately followed by the letter R. So those ones make a strong R sound. They're not a soft R, like when you say read or write or like the color red. They have a strong sound in them, like herb or person. Next, we have the word serpent, worse, pearl, dirty, birth, shirt, twirl, swirl, purse, curl, curve, curb, hurl, turkey, turnip, purpose, blurred, slowly, quickly, beautiful, spurt, and further. So all of these words, you're hearing the strong sound in them, which is not usually a sound you would hear if it was just an R by itself. Now let's jump into our language arts notes for this week. So we have a few things that we're going to go over, and they are going to show up in your practice book, and they're also going to show up in your grammar packet. So you're going to see them in a few different places. So pay close attention to them. Now, the first thing we're going to do that you're going to see in your packets is they're going to talk to you about pronouns. So I wanted to do a quick review of pronouns before we got into the remainder of, of our notes. Now, pronouns are usually found, we have subject pronouns and object pronouns. So the subject pronouns are found in the subject part of the sentence, and the object pronouns are found in the predicate part of the sentence. Now, there are also possessive pronouns, but we're not going to talk about those right now. Those are ones that show ownership. Remember, when we were talking about possessive nouns, we're talking about something that is owned by something else. Now, a pronoun takes the place of a noun. So pronouns can be like him or he, she or her, it, we, us, they, them, I, me, you. Anything that's taking the place of the noun, so the name of whatever that thing is that you're talking about or that person that you're talking about, is called a pronoun. So instead of saying Bob went to the store, I'm going to say he went to the store. He is the pronoun. He takes the place of the name Bob in the sentence. Or you can say I went to the store with Bob. Now Bob is in the predicate part of the sentence, so it's no longer a subject pronoun. Now it's an object pronoun. So we're not going to say I went to the store with he. We're going to say I went to the store with him. So you see how the form changes a little bit depending on where in the sentence that pronoun is. Same thing with she or her. Khadija has a new kitten. She has a new kitten. Or I could say the kitten plays with Khadija, and I'm going to replace that with and say the kitten plays with her. So she and her both take the place of the name Khadija in the sentence, but they take a different form depending on where in the sentence you find it. And you know this because you guys already naturally do this on your own. You can tell when it sounds correct or when it sounds incorrect based on where it's being placed. So where did you put the book? I can say, where did you put it? So instead of saying the book again, which is going to be my noun, I replace it with the word it. My sister and I played tag. You can say we played tag, or my friend played tag with my sister and me. Or I can say my friend played tag with us. So us takes the place of my sister and me. Or if it's in the beginning of the if it's in the beginning of the sentence, I'm going to say we. Instead of saying my sister and I can say we. And the same rules apply for they and them. And you can go ahead and read through the example sentences for I, me, and you. You say, I am going to the park instead of saying my name. Does Sarah want to go to the park with me? Or are you going to play hide and seek? So all of these are different examples of ways to use pronouns. Now, the next thing that's going to show up in your packets is going to be about syllables. So we've talked about open and closed syllables before. We're going to take a quick review. Your assignment is going to focus on closed syllables. Now remember, closed syllables mean that that syllable ends with a consonant letter, and it has a short vowel sound in it usually. Closed syllables are like the word sudden. So it has two closed syllables. You can see that the first syllable, S-U-D, ends with the letter D. So that's a consonant. And then the second syllable, D-E-N, ends with an N, and that's also a consonant. So remember, words will have at least one syllable, and each syllable needs to have a vowel sound in it. Now, when you have words like sudden, or mitten, or litter, or button, these are all words that have a double consonant in the middle of them. When you have a double consonant, remember to split your syllable right in between that double consonant. So remember, closed syllables are any time that syllable ends with a consonant letter. You can have words that have both open and closed syllables and more than one of each, depending on how long the word is. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about are verbs. So there's a good amount of things that we're going to go over with verbs this week. So please make sure you're watching this video more than once and that you're watching it very carefully. Write down any questions that you have and make sure to let me know what they are so that I can help you if there's anything that's confusing. Now, before we start with verbs, I want to remind you that a complete sentence has two parts. It's got a subject and it's got a predicate. So the subject is the who and the predicate is what. The predicate is where you're going to find the verb for that sentence, and it's a part of the sentence that tells you what the subject is or does. Now, a verb tells you what the subject is or does. To find the verb, ask yourself, what is the sentence telling us that the subject is or the subject is doing? Now, if we're talking specifically only about what the subject is doing, we're talking about an action verb. An action verb shows an action, tells you what that subject is doing. Now, a lot of times, or sometimes, the action can't be seen. So you'll read through the sentence and you're not seeing a word like run or jump or play. Sometimes it's words that are describing feelings like thought or worried or loved or hated or feared. So our example sentences here, I've bolded the verbs in each sentence. So I can say, I learned bears hibernate in the winter. So learned is my verb. It's what I did. She wrote a beautiful poem in class. We made a special presentation. He is a brilliant scientist. They are very happy. So is and are, those are going to be our verbs here. They're not action verbs, but they are still verbs. She thought about her best friend. I worried about the test this week. The grapes tasted so sweet. The students rushed out to lunch. I love playing checkers with my sister. So take a look at those bold-faced words. Those are going to be our verbs in these sentences. Now we have another kind of verb called helping verbs. So these are also called auxiliary verbs. So the word auxiliary means to help. It's something that's supportive or it's helpful. So if you see that, that's what that means. So helping verbs or auxiliary verbs add more meaning to the sentence. They're used to express the tense, so past, present, future, and to add emphasis to show you that something is important. So the three most common auxiliary verbs are to be, to have, and to do. Now those have different forms that we're using them. So to be can be expressed as am, is, are, was, were, be, and been. All of those are different forms of the helping verb to be. Now, to have can be expressed as have, has, or had. And to do can be expressed as do, does, or did. So be, do, and have can either stand alone, like they can just be there by themselves, or they can be auxiliary or helping verbs. And you can tell when these verbs are helping if they're teamed with another verb, right? So you put them together and they pair up with another verb to create something that's called a verb phrase, right? A phrase is a group of words. It's not a complete sentence. So a verb phrase is more than one word in that is part of the verb. Now, the following sentences that I put over here are examples of helping verbs. So if I say, I am having another piece of pizza. So here's am is my helping verb, and my main verb is the word having. She is making dinner for us now. Is my helping verb, and making is my main verb. I do not know the answer. Do, or you can pair it as do not, is going to be my helping verb, and know is my main verb. I have been running. So have been are two helping verbs or two auxiliary verbs. Remember, auxiliary just means helping. And running is my main verb. She was given the grand prize, and the baby has made a big mess. Now, we talked about how helping verbs can show what tense we're talking about. So if it's happening in the past, in the present, or in the future, those helping verbs let us identify when it's happening. So some past tense ones are was, were, did, been, or adding an ed to the end of your verb. Those all show past tense. Present tense is going to be is, am, are, does, if you're adding an s, es, or ing, or adding nothing to the verb. I run at the park. That's present tense. Or I am running at the park. Or he is running at the park. Or she does jumping jacks at the park. Future tense is telling you when something is going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And that's usually paired with the word will. When you put will before it, it usually tells you that something has not happened yet. It's going to happen in the future. So will be, will do, will have, all tell you that something is going to happen later on, but it hasn't happened yet. So main verbs, we can also tell when a main verb shows tense. So if it's past tense, if that main verb has an ed at the end of it, or if it changes its form, right? Remember, we have some irregular ones that don't follow the same rule when those verbs are being changed to past tense. So make becomes made, run becomes ran, and so on. Write becomes wrote. Those are all irregular ones. So usually you're adding an ed to your main verb, or you're changing it into its irregular past tense form to show past tense. If you're showing present tense, you're adding that s, es, or ing, or you're adding the word are before that main verb. We are walking, we are writing, are or is. So let me add that in here for you guys. So she is talking, he is playing. Or you add nothing to it. So she walks, he watches. We sing, they walk, they dance. Now, future tense, again, you're adding the word will before your main verb. So they will go, we will sleep, she will bake, he will run, and so on. So I know this is a lot of information for you, but there are things that you guys have been using in the past. We're just putting a name to it now. So remember, a verb tells you what something is or does. An action verb describes an action. A helping verb or an auxiliary verb helps the main verb, and it gives you more information by telling you when something is happening. We already know how to change a verb to show past, present, or future by adding s or es, ed, or adding the word will to show when something is happening. Now, the last bit that we're going to talk about are titles of publications. So publications are things that are published or printed or put into some form where it's being distributed to people. Now, when we're talking about TV shows, movies, books, CDs, newspapers, magazines, these are all things that are long, right? We're going to underline or italicize. Italicize is when you're writing them kind of slanted like that, where it's not, the letters are not just upright, they're kind of at an angle. They're leaning over. For long titles, that's your biggest clue. Long titles, we underline or italicize. For short titles, we put them in quotation marks. So if I'm talking about the name of an entire newspaper or a whole magazine or a whole TV series or show or a whole movie or the entire book, not just a chapter, we're going to underline or italicize those. So I put a couple examples for you there, like Wildcrafts is a TV show, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is a book, The Mouse and the Motorcycle. We can do like the CD audio book for that one, underlined. Boss Baby is a movie. Where the Wild Things Are is a book title. The San Diego Union Tribune, that's a magazine. National Geographic magazine is also a magazine. So all of these, you can do either one. So I switched them up. Any of those ones that are long, either underline or italicize, it doesn't matter which one you pick. I prefer to underline. It makes it easier for me to identify it when I'm reading it, right? Because it's more visual, I can see the underline. For short things, so we're talking about like a short story that's in a book, or an article that's in a newspaper or magazine, or an essay, just something, a short piece that somebody wrote, the name of a song or a poem. all of these short things we're going to put in quotation marks. So an example of a short story is called The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. The song Baby Shark. Where the Sidewalk Ends is a poem by Shel Silverstein. How to Organize Your Room can be an article that's maybe in a newspaper. Now, one thing that's very important that you guys need to remember is you capitalize every word in a title except articles, conjunctions, and prepositions that are not at the beginning or end of the title. We only capitalize the important words. So when here, where we're saying where the sidewalk ends, the is not an important word. Over here, to is not an important word. Unless those short little words are at the beginning of a sentence, like over here, the raven, because the is at the beginning of this title, we're going to capitalize it. So any short little words over here, like we have the mouse and the motorcycle, the words and the are not important words. So those are lowercase. Over here, same thing, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone and the are short. So anytime you have words that are short or not really important, unless they're at the very beginning of that title, we don't capitalize it. Or we do capitalize it only when it's at the beginning of that title. If it's found somewhere in the middle, then we keep it lowercase. So remember, capitalize all of the important words in any title that you're working with. So that's going to take you through to the end of the notes. Please go back through it very carefully. Go back through particularly the verb section because there was a lot of information in there. You can access this document in our shared folder. Rewatch the video for additional explanations, but let's go ahead and get into your reading for this week. So we're starting Unit 3. We're going to be on Unit 3, Week 1, and this is an excerpt from a book that we actually had in our classroom library called The Qriket in Times Square. I think some of you may have read it. If not, if you have some time, try to get your hands on this book. It is a really great story.
Genre, fantasy. The Qriket in Times Square by George Selden. Drawings by Garth Williams. Essential question. What makes a new friend feel welcome? Read how two unlikely friends make a Qriket feel at home in a strange place. Chester. Tucker Mouse had been watching the Bellinis and listening to what they said. Next to scrounging, eavesdropping on human beings was what he enjoyed most. That was one of the reasons he lived in the Times Square subway station. As soon as the family disappeared, he darted out across the floor and scooted up to the newsstand. At one side, the boards had separated and there was a wide space he could jump through. He'd been in a few times before, just exploring. For a moment, he stood under the three-legged stool, letting his eyes get used to the darkness. Then he jumped on it. "Psst," he whispered. "Hey, you up there, are you awake?" There was no answer. "Psst, psst, hey," Tucker whispered again, louder this time. From the shelf above came a scuffling, like little feet feeling their way to the edge. "Who is that going, psst?" said a voice. "It's me," said Tucker, "down here on the stool." A black head with two shiny black eyes peered down at him. "Who are you?" "A mouse," said Tucker. "Who are you?" "I'm Chester Qriket," said the Qriket. He had a high musical voice. Everything he said seemed to be spoken to an unheard melody. "My name's Tucker," said Tucker Mouse. "Can I come up?" "I guess so," said Chester Qriket. "This isn't my house anyway." Tucker jumped up beside the Qriket and looked him all over. "A Qriket," he said admiringly. "So you're a Qriket. I never saw one before." "I've seen mice before," the Qriket said. "I knew quite a few back in Connecticut." "Is that where you're from?" asked Tucker. "Yes," said Chester. "I guess I'll never see it again," he added wistfully. "How did you get to New York?" asked Tucker Mouse. "It's a long story," sighed the Qriket. "Tell me," said Tucker. settling back on his haunches. He loved to hear stories. It was almost as much fun as eavesdropping, if the story was true. "Well, it must have been 3 days ago," Chester Cricket began. "I was sitting on top of my stump, just enjoying the weather and thinking how nice it was that summer had started. I live inside an old tree stump next to a willow tree, and I often go up to the roof to look around. And I'd been practicing jumping that day, too. On the other side of the stump from the willow tree, there's a brook that runs past, and I'd been jumping back and forth across it to get my legs in condition for the summer. I do a lot of jumping, you know." "Me too," said Tucker Mouse, "especially around the rush hour." "And I had just finished jumping when I smelled something," Chester went on. "Liverwurst, which I love." "You like liverwurst?" Tucker broke in. Wait, just wait." In one leap, he sprang down all the way from the shelf to the floor and dashed over to his drain pipe. Chester shook his head as he watched him go. He thought Tucker was a very excitable person, even for a mouse. Inside the drain pipe, Tucker's nest was a jumble of papers, scraps of cloth, buttons, lost jewelry, small change, and everything else that can be picked up in a subway station. Tucker tossed things left and right in a wild search. Neatness was not one of the things he aimed at in life. At last he discovered what he was looking for, a big piece of liverwurst he had found earlier that evening. It was meant to be for breakfast tomorrow, but he decided that meeting his first cricket was a special occasion. Holding the liverwurst between his teeth, he whisked back to the newsstand. "Look," he said proudly, dropping the meat in front of Chester Cricket. "Liverwurst! You continue the story. We'll enjoy a snack, too." "That's very nice of you," said Chester. He was touched that a mouse he had known only a few minutes would share his food with him. "I had a little chocolate before, but besides that, nothing for 3 days." Eat," said Tucker. He bit the liverwurst into 2 pieces and gave Chester the bigger one. "So, you smelled the liverwurst, then what happened?" Stop and check. Visualize. Which details help you visualize Tucker's nest? "I hopped down from the stump and went off toward the smell," said Chester. "Very logical," said Tucker Mouse, munching with his cheeks full. "Exactly what I would have done." "It was coming from a picnic basket," said Chester. "A couple of tuffets away from my stump, the meadow begins, and there was a whole bunch of people having a picnic. They had hard-boiled eggs and cold roast chicken and roast beef and a whole lot of other things besides the liverwurst sandwiches which I smelled." Tucker Mouse moaned with pleasure at the thought of all that food. "They were having such a good time laughing and singing songs that they didn't notice me when I jumped into the picnic basket," continued Chester. "I was sure they wouldn't mind if I had just a taste." "Naturally not," said Tucker Mouse sympathetically. "Why mind? Plenty for all. Who could blame you?" "Now I have to admit," Chester went on, "I had more than a taste. As a matter of fact, I ate so much that I couldn't keep my eyes open, what with being tired from the jumping and everything, and I fell asleep right there in the picnic basket. The first thing I knew, somebody had put a bag on top of me that had the last of the roast beef sandwiches in it. I couldn't move." "Imagine!" Tucker exclaimed. "Trapped under roast beef sandwiches. Well, there are worse fates." "At first I wasn't too frightened," said Chester. "After all, I thought, they probably come from New Canaan or some other nearby town. They'll have to unpack the basket sooner or later. Little did I know." He shook his head and sighed. I could feel the basket being carried into a car and riding somewhere and then being lifted down. That must have been the railroad station. Then I went up again, and there was a rattling and roaring sound, the way a train makes. By this time I was pretty scared. I knew every minute was taking me farther away from my stump, but there wasn't anything I could do. I was getting awfully cramped, too, under those roast beef sandwiches. "Didn't you try to eat your way out?" asked Tucker. "I didn't have any room," said Chester, "but every now and then the train would give a lurch, and I managed to free myself a little. We traveled on, and then the train stopped. I didn't have any idea where we were, but as soon as the basket was carried off, I could tell from the noise it must be New York." "You never were here before?" Tucker asked. "Goodness, no," said Chester, "but I've heard about it. There was a swallow I used to know who told about flying over New York every spring and fall on her way to the north and back. But what would I be doing here?" He shifted uneasily from one set of legs to another. "I'm a country cricket." "Don't worry," said Tucker Mouse. "I'll feed you liverwurst. You'll be all right. Go on with the story." "It's almost over," said Cricket. "The people got off one train and walked a ways and got on another, even noisier than the first." "Must have been the subway," said Tucker. "I guess so," Chester Cricket said. "You can imagine how scared I was. I didn't know where I was going. For all I knew, they could have been heading for Texas, although I don't guess many people from Texas come all the way to Connecticut for a picnic." "It could happen," said Tucker, nodding his head. "Anyway, I worked furiously to get loose, and finally I made it. When they got off the second train, I took a flying leap and landed in a pile of dirt over in the corner of this place where we are." "Such an introduction to New York," said Tucker, "to land in a pile of dirt in the Times Square subway station. Tisk, tisk, tisk." "And here I am," Chester concluded forlornly. "I've been lying over there for 3 days, not knowing what to do. At last I got so nervous I began to chirp." "That was the sound," interrupted Tucker Mouse. "I heard it, but I didn't know what it was." "Yes, that was me," said Chester. "Usually I don't chirp until later on in the summer, but my goodness, I had to do something." The cricket had been sitting next to the edge of the shelf. For some reason, perhaps it was a faint noise, like padded feet tiptoeing across the floor, he happened to look down. A shadowy form that had been crouching silently below in the darkness made a spring and landed right next to Tucker and Chester. "Watch out!" Chester shouted. "A cat!" He dove head first into the matchbox. Hairy Cat. Chester buried his head in the Kleenex. He didn't want to see his new friend Tucker Mouse get killed. Back in Connecticut, he had sometimes watched the one-sided fights of cats and mice in the meadow, and unless the mice were near their holes, the fights always ended in the same way. But this cat had been upon them too quickly. Tucker couldn't have escaped. There wasn't a sound. Chester lifted his head and very cautiously looked behind him. The cat, a huge tiger cat with gray-green eyes and black stripes along his body, was sitting on his hind legs, switching his tail around his forepaws. And directly between those forepaws, in the very jaws of his enemy, sat Tucker Mouse. He was watching Chester curiously. The cricket began to make frantic signs that the mouse should look up and see what was looming over him. Very casually, Tucker raised his head. The cat looked straight down on him. "Oh, him," said Tucker, chucking the cat under the chin with his right front paw. "He's my best friend. Come out from the matchbox." Chester crept out, looking first at one, then the other. Chester, meet Harry Cat, said Tucker. Harry, this is Chester. He's a cricket. I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance, said Harry Cat in a silky voice. Hello, said Chester. He was sort of ashamed because of all the fuss he'd made. I wasn't scared for myself, but I thought cats and mice were enemies. In the country, maybe, said Tucker, but in New York, we gave up those old habits long ago. Harry is my oldest friend. He lives with me over in the drain pipe. So, how was the scrounging tonight, Harry? Not so good, said Harry Cat. I was over in the ash cans on the east side, but those rich people don't throw out as much garbage as they should. Chester, make that noise again for Harry, said Tucker Mouse. Chester lifted the black wings that were carefully folded across his back, and with a quick, expert stroke, drew the top one over the bottom. A thrum echoed through the station. Lovely, very lovely, said the cat. This cricket has talent. I thought it was singing, said Tucker, but you do it like playing a violin, with one wing on the other? Yes, said Chester. These wings aren't much good for flying, but I prefer music anyhow. He made 3 rapid chirps. Tucker Mouse and Harry Cat smiled at each other. It makes me want to purr to hear it, said Harry. Some people say a cricket goes chee-chee-chee, explained Chester, and others say treat-treat-treat, but we crickets don't think it sounds like either one of those. It sounds to me as if you were going crick, 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 said Harry. Maybe that's why they call him a cricket, said Tucker. They all laughed. Tucker had a squeaky laugh that sounded as if he were hiccuping. Chester was feeling much happier now. The future did not seem nearly as gloomy as it had over in the pile of dirt in the corner. Are you going to stay a while in New York? Asked Tucker. I guess I'll have to, said Chester. I don't know how to get home. Well, we could always take you to Grand Central Station and put you on a train going back to Connecticut, said Tucker. But why don't you give the city a try? Meet new people, see new things. Mario likes you very much. Stop and check. Visualize. How do Tucker and Harry feel about Chester's chirping? Which words help you visualize their reaction? Yes, but his mother doesn't, said Chester. She thinks I carry germs. Germs? Said Tucker scornfully. She wouldn't know a germ if one gave her a black eye. Pay no attention. Too bad you couldn't have found more successful friends, said Harry Cat. I fear for the future of this newsstand. It's true, echoed Tucker sadly. They're going broke fast. He jumped up on a pile of magazines and read off the names in the half-light that slanted through the cracks in the wooden cover. Art News, Musical America. Who would read them for a few long hairs? I don't understand the way you talk, said Chester. Back in the meadow he had listened to bullfrogs and woodchucks and rabbits, even a few snakes, but he had never heard anyone speak like Tucker Mouse. What is a long hair? Tucker scratched his head and thought a moment. A long hair is an extra refined person, he said. You take an Afghan hound, that's a long hair. Do Afghan hounds read Musical America? Asked the cricket. They would if they could, said Tucker. Chester shook his head. I'm afraid I won't get along in New York, he said. Oh, sure you will, squeaked Tucker Mouse. Harry, suppose we take Chester up and show him Times Square. Would you like that, Chester? I guess so, said Chester, although he was really a little leery of venturing out into New York City. The 3 of them jumped down to the floor. The crack in the side of the newsstand was just wide enough for Harry to get through. As they crossed the station floor, Tucker pointed out the local sites of interest, such as the Nedick's lunch counter. Tucker spent a lot of time around there, and the loft's candy store. Then they came to the drain pipe. Chester had to make short little hops to keep from hitting his head as they went up. There seemed to be hundreds of twistings and turnings, and many other pipes that opened off the main route, but Tucker Mouse knew his way perfectly, even in the dark. At last Chester saw light above them. One more hop brought him out onto the sidewalk, and there he gasped, holding his breath and crouching against the cement. They were standing at one corner of the Times building, which is at the south end of Times Square. Above the Qriket, towers that seemed like mountains of light rose up into the night sky. Even this late, the neon lights were still blazing. Reds, blues, greens, and yellows flashed down on him, and the air was full of the roar of traffic and the hum of human beings. It was as if Times Square were a kind of shell, with colors and noises breaking in great waves inside it. Chester's heart hurt him, and he closed his eyes. The sight was too terrible and beautiful for a cricket who up to now had measured high things by the height of his willow tree and sounds by the burble of a running brook. "How do you like it?" asked Tucker Mouse. "Well, it's quite something," Chester stuttered. "You should see it New Year's Eve," said Hairy Cat. Gradually Chester's eyes got used to the lights. He looked up, and way far above them, above New York, and above the whole world, he made out a star that he knew was a star he used to look at back in Connecticut. When they had gone down to the station and Chester was in the matchbox again, he thought about that star. It made him feel better to think that there was one familiar thing twinkling above him amid so much that was new and strange. Stop and check. Make predictions. Make a prediction about whether Chester will return to Connecticut or stay in New York. Use story details to support your prediction.
So that takes us to the end of the excerpt from the story, The Qriket in Times Square. I do suggest you guys go back and read the rest of it. If you can get your hands on the book, it is a great story. Now we're going to look at our next short story in our literature anthology book, and this is a legend, and it's called The Girl and the Chinu.
Genre, legend. Visualize. How can you make new friends feel welcome? The Girl and the Chinu. The ferocious Chinu of the north was a cold-hearted predator and a thief. With one swipe, the Chinu's talons uprooted beans, corn, and squash to satisfy his enormous hunger. Fish jumped out of the water at the sight of his terrifying figure. Whenever the Chinu howled, hailstones fell from the skies, battering the homes of my people. So my brothers and I were prepared for war when we followed the Chinu's giant footprints to our winter home. Instead, we found my sister dressing the monster's wounds. My sister never spoke much, but her quiet nature and caring ways were complementary to the skill of my brothers and me as hunters. Without a word, she gathered firewood, tanned hides, repaired the wigwam, and prepared our meals. She turned nervously toward us. "Brothers," she whispered, "Grandfather will be joining us for dinner tonight." Puzzled, my brothers and I looked at each other. The fearsome giant yawned, blowing icicles off branches overhead. He bellowed, "Granddaughter, what will you be making tonight?" I spoke with a shaky voice. "Only a hare and a goose, Grandfather." The Chinu snorted and disappeared into the woods. He returned with 4 large moose. My sister prepared a feast unlike any other we had ever seen. I wondered how long our sister could keep this treacherous beast tame. The Chinu was not trustworthy. Surely he would soon destroy everything in his path. But somehow my sister's kindness changed his ways. One warm night, my sister turned to the Chinu and said, "Grandfather, it's time to return to the village." He nodded and walked up to the fire. He had always kept away from the fire, but now he asked for more firewood. My sister added wood until the flames shot up over his head. He coughed and moaned. "Grandfather?" my worried sister called. Once the smoke cleared, the Chinu had become a wrinkled old man. Hunched over the fire, he coughed up a piece of ice shaped like a Chinu. It was his icy heart. The old man smiled as the ice melted. "Let's go home," he said. This is how my people tell the story of the Passamaquoddy girl who melted the heart of the Chinu. Make connections. How does the girl make the Chinu feel welcome? Compare the different ways in which friendships form.
All right, let's go ahead and get into our Readers and Writers workshop. We're going to open up our Unit 3, Week 1. You have your vocabulary words, and our story in this book is a fantasy, and it's called At the Library.
Genre, fantasy. At the library. Essential question. How can you make new friends feel welcome? Read how a new librarian and an unlikely family become great friends. Rick Dodson admired the pink and orange sky as he waved goodbye to Mrs. Rio and locked the library door. As the sun began its descent behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, Rick started walking to his office to collect his jacket. Seeing a jumble of books on a reading table, he sighed and began to gather them into a neat pile. "No," he stated firmly and returned the books to the table. "Not tonight." The librarian never left any books out, but today was his birthday, which meant a brisk walk to the Cupcake Cafe for a birthday treat before it closed at 5:30 p.m. That evening, as he sat at home in his book-filled living room, Rick thought about the old friends who had called to wish him a happy birthday. If only this job had not required him to move halfway across the country. After 6 months here, he had made more than one new acquaintance, but no real friends yet. Books are my friends, he thought, which reminded him of the books sitting on the table at the library. I might as well go back tonight and shelve them, he decided. He entered the library and flicked on the lights. Immediately he noticed a book, Small World, face down on the floor. "What's going on?" he muttered as he bent down and cautiously lifted up the book. "Ah!" he yelled, and dropped the book. 4 miniature figures scrambled out of the way as the book landed on the floor with a thud. "Mr. Dodson," exclaimed a breathless voice, "we are enchanted to make your acquaintance." "What? Who?" Rick stammered. "We're the Bookers. I'm William. This is Emily, and our children, Harry and Clementine. By the way, happy birthday." "You know it's my birthday?" "Naturally. We read your file when you arrived 6 months ago. It's only logical that we would want to learn about the new librarian." "You were scrounging through my files?" Rick said, collapsing into a nearby chair. He rubbed his eyes, but the tiny figures were still there, looking up at him expectantly. Suddenly, the nimble Bookers began shimmying up the table. "We're absolutely trustworthy," Emily assured him. "Haven't you heard of Bookers?" William asked. "Every library has Bookers." "We ensure everything runs smoothly," said Emily. "Seen any mice around? They love to gnaw on everything." Rick slowly shook his head. "I do nightly rodent patrols," Harry stated proudly. "Those mice run at the sight of me," he added scornfully. "Do your chairs ever squeak?" inquired Clementine. "No, that's because we oil them." Rick considered the past 6 months. He hadn't seen one mouse, his chairs never squeaked, and his pencils were never dull. "The pencils?" he asked. We sharpen them nightly, William replied. But why? Asked Rick. Look around, exclaimed William. We work and read. Bookers and libraries are complementary. We belong together. To be honest, Mr. Dodson, said Emily, we wanted to meet you because we thought that we could be friends. Rick Dodson grinned. Call me Rick, and I'd love to be friends, he said. Rick eventually made other new friends, but he still spent many evenings with the Bookers. He bought a toy car for Harry's rodent patrol, and he read scary stories aloud to Clementine. Every year on his birthday, he brought cupcakes for his friends to share with him. Make connections. Talk about how the Bookers made Rick Dodson feel welcome. How do you make new students in your school feel welcome?
All right, let's go over our comprehension strategy and skill for this week. We're going to be talking about visualizing. So this is something we've touched on before. Remember, visualize is just a fancy way to say imagine. So when you visualize something, you're taking the words and the descriptions that the author has put into the text, and you're using them to create an image in your head to be able to imagine what's going on in the story.
Visualize. When you read a story, picturing the plot, events, characters, and setting in your mind can add to your understanding and enjoyment. As you read the first paragraph of At the Library, visualize what is happening. Find text evidence. As I read the first paragraph on page 167, I picture Rick Dodson in the library at the end of the day. The descriptive details help me visualize the sunset and Rick waving goodbye to Mrs. Rio. Rick Dodson admired the pink and orange sky as he waved goodbye to Mrs. Rio and locked the library door. As the sun began its descent behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, Rick started walking to his office to collect his jacket. Seeing a jumble of books on a reading table, he sighed and began to gather them into a neat pile. I can visualize Rick looking at the jumble of books on the table and starting to pick them up. I imagine him shaking his head when he decides to wait until the next day. Point of view. Every story has a narrator or a person who tells the story. The narrator's point of view tells how the narrator feels or thinks about the characters or events. When the narrator uses pronouns such as he, she, or they, the story has a third-person narrator. Find text evidence. When I reread page 167 of At the Library, I see that the narrator uses the pronouns he, him, and his to describe Rick. This story has a third-person narrator. I can use details from the story to figure out the narrator's point of view. Graphic organizer. Details. Rick went out for his birthday treat by himself. Rick thought about his old friends who had called to wish him a happy birthday. Point of view. The story has a third-person narrator who understands that Rick misses his old friends and wants new friends. Caption. Pronouns such as his and him are clues to the narrator.
Now here they talk about a third-person point of view. When you have a third-person point of view, you're talking about something that is basically being observed. But when something is written from a first-person point of view or a first-person perspective, that's when you're talking about yourself. That's when you're using the words I, me, we, us. Those all tell what perspective you're writing from. So if it's a third-person point of view, you're reading the story from the viewpoint of someone who is talking about something that they observed, or they're telling you about something else that happened that they were not a part of. When you're writing something or reading something with a first person point of view, you're reading or writing about something that's happening to the narrator. So if you're the narrator or you're the writer, you're writing about yourself. Or if you're reading a story, that person is writing about something that they were a part of or that they were involved in. Now, next we're going to talk about our genre. So our genre this week is fantasy.
Fantasy. The selection at the library is a fantasy. A fantasy includes invented characters and settings, has elements that could not exist in real life, often has illustrations. Find text evidence. At the library is a fantasy. The story takes place in a library, which is a realistic setting, but the illustrations show that the bookers are tiny people who would not exist in real life. Use illustrations. Illustrations give the reader visual clues about the story's characters, setting, and events. This illustration shows me what size the bookers are. Context clues. As you read at the library, you may come across words you don't know. To figure out the meaning of an unfamiliar word, look for clues in nearby phrases and sentences. Find text evidence. When I reread the first paragraph on page 167 of At the Library, the phrases pink and orange sky and behind the Blue Ridge Mountains help me figure out what descent means. Rick Dodson admired the pink and orange sky as he waved goodbye to Mrs. Rio and locked the library door. As the sun began its descent behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, Rick started walking to his office to collect his jacket.
All right, that takes us to the end of our notes for this week. Please make sure you go back and review everything that's in the document, especially as you're working through your packets and your practice book and grammar assignments. There was a lot of information in our ELA notes for this week, so please make sure you're reviewing it very carefully. If you have any questions, definitely let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have an amazing day. Take care.